And we are live. Welcome to the official Debrief podcast. My name is Michael Mataluni. I'm joined by the creator of Rebelliously Curious with Chrissy Newton. Chrissy Newton, welcome. We've also got the extraordinary Ralph Blumenthal here today. Ralph was a reporter for the New York Times from 1964 to 2009 and has written 7 books based on investigative crime reporting and cultural history. His latest book, The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack was published on March 15th, 2021. Welcome, you guys.
Hey.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, Chrissy. It's great. It's great to have you both. Chrissy, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of get this ball rolling. Share with us what you've got here for Ralph.
Ralph, I'm going to start off easy and basic. How did you get into the UAP subject? And also, do you see any parallels with your work and Dr. John Mack's?
Okay, well, I grew up, like so many in my generation, reading science fiction. I was a great fan of Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov. It seems so quaint today to talk about, landings on Mars. But that kind of passed, and I went into journalism. I became a New York Times reporter. I covered very earthbound subjects like the mafia, Holocaust, Nazi war criminals, corrupt politicians. So that all changed in 2004 when I was a correspondent in Texas for the New York Times, and I picked up a copy of John Mack's second book, Passport to the Cosmos. I knew nothing about him. I was very naive, as he, as it turned out, was sort of naive about things. And although he was very famous by that time, he'd been on Oprah. He'd written 2 bestsellers, including the one I had about alien abduction. He was a Harvard psychiatrist who, pursued this very strange field of alien abduction stories. So I read the book and I thought, I got to interview this guy. He's amazing. Harvard psychiatrist interested in aliens. I thought it was a natural. And a few days later, I picked up the paper and he was dead. I mean, he'd been run down in London, almost age 75. It was a complete accident. The guy was drunk, the driver. John Mack looked the wrong way, as Americans do in London. And he was gone. So I then called the family and, little by little arranged to get access to his papers, his archives, his personal journals, his therapy sessions, himself, and all his notes, and produce the book. But that's how I got into it.
Wow. Can you take us down the road of John Mack? He's so fascinating. Being a psychologist and researching these types of phenomenons, I find amazing, especially when you get into psychology within a group of people that would ridicule him so much. Can you talk to me about the ridicule that happened around him and his peers and how he dealt with it? And if you know this, and then, what was it like for him by the end of his life? Because I have other questions around that, but I'm curious around the ridicule within his own, academic society.
Right. Well, good question. Well, he was the least likely person really to get into this. He was brought up in a very conventional German Jewish home in New York. His parents were both professors, his stepmother and father. And he started off very interested in social justice issues. He worked to bring mental health care to Cambridge, which is a downtrodden part of Boston. He then wrote a book that won the Pulitzer Prize, a biography of Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence. He got very involved in Middle East politics. He tried to, work on peace talks between the Arabs and Israelis. He was very, socially conscious, social-minded. And then through a series of circumstances I outlined in my book, The Believer, he heard about the alien abduction phenomenon. And because it came at the right time in his life, he was sort of prepared through some experiences he had at holotropic breathing. He was sort of attuned to this spiritual world beyond the senses. But when he heard about alien abduction, that gripped him And he gathered his own circle of abductees or experiences, as he preferred to call them, around him, and investigated their stories. So he was captivated, not captured. He never was, to his somewhat disappointment. Although he said it kept him purer that he wasn't an experiencer himself. But that's how he got into it. And of course, as you suggest, Chrissy, he endured a lot of ridicule at Harvard, and eventually what I call an inquisition, a secret investigation into his research and his methods, which he overcame without any discipline. So that's the short version. I mean, he suffered a lot.
You mentioned his procedures and his method, and they came under scrutiny in academia. Can you spell out a little bit more like what those methods and procedures are, and if they would stand up to scientific scrutiny today?
Yeah, I think they would. I mean, he described what he came under criticism for at Harvard, particularly, was what he called this process of co-creation, which is a kind of a subtle concept. He was accused basically of implanting these ideas into his subjects or patients. They never could decide what they were. They weren't really patients because there was nothing wrong with them except that they'd had these, unbelievable experiences which no one could explain. Anyway, so he worked with these people. He didn't say from the beginning, as some people wanted him to say, you're crazy, go away. This didn't happen. This couldn't possibly happen. Everybody agreed it couldn't possibly happen, and yet something happened which no one could explain. And he was willing to listen. So what he did was this process of what he called co-creation, where he would participate in reconstructing these experiences, whatever they were, with the people, sometimes through hypnosis, which was controversial in and of itself, because it always carried the possibility that the hypnotist was implanting his ideas on the person. But often the memories were conscious, so they were not, induced through hypnosis. They were remembered quite openly. But that was his method, and basically he was a very good listener. Ever since he got involved in childhood psychology, where he had to listen to what children were saying. He developed a very good bedside manner where he was very charismatic. He was tall. He was very good looking with, cobalt eyes. People tended to trust him, and he was worthy of that trust, it turned out.
Yeah, I find that interesting with him because there is this part that I noted when I read about John Mack, that the trauma that came from is not, the mental health issues and stuff would come after the experience, not before the experience.
Exactly.
Right. And the one thing about him was his attachment to his patients. And I'm curious if you know that, because he said that his stories the stories that he was hearing through experiences really touched him. And he was a very sentimental man from what I read. How close was he to his patients and his relationship? Were they friends? Did he keep a distance from them? Because it really says on what he believes and his own bias out of this, when you are very close to your patients. So did he have a line or some kind of way that he would distinguish between, how close he would get to them?
Yeah, he definitely drew a line. He was a very smart psychiatrist, which comes through in his writings and his appearances with them. He never crossed the line. Sometimes his enemies, in one particular case, try to make it look like he had an improper relationship with one of the experiencers who turned out to be a hoaxer. But he always had a woman assistant with him when he did these hypnotic regressions and interviews. He was very, very careful. He was attracted to other women outside his marriage, and I make a point of that in the book. He was always searching for something missing in his life, but never with his patients. There was not a hint of any impropriety there. He was very smart that way. He would never have crossed that line. So, I paint him with his warts. But that was not one of his failures, absolutely not. And anyone who tried to suggest that would be really wrong. He kept up the highest possible professional standards when it came to dealing with these people.
Ralph, what was the most fascinating thing that you came across when you got all these memoirs and, you really had an opportunity to dig deep into his life? What kind of blew you away?
Wow, that's a tough one. In this field, every story is kind of topped by the next one. So I would say one of the things that was really touching and very interesting in his stories was he lost his mother at age 8.5 months. She died of appendicitis when he was a baby, and he never understood what it was that took her away. And in a hypnosis of his own, when he was hypnotized by a Brazilian therapist, which was quite fascinating because I got that tape as part of his papers, he kind of realized that the loss of his mother at that young age traumatized him to the point where he was always searching for something missing. And that turned out to be kind of a key to his interest in intelligence in the universe. He was looking for something missing. And, I'm not a psychiatrist. I didn't invent that theory, but people around him pointed that out. So that was pretty fascinating, I would say. That was kind of the Rosebud moment, if you remember the sled in Citizen Kane that brings back the whole life story of Charles Kane on his deathbed. Well, this might be the little key that unlocked a secret part of John Mack's story. But his story was so much bigger than that it's not that simple. But anyway, so that was one thing. And also the stories he heard, my God, the things he dealt with from his experiencers. As I said, one story was crazier than the next. That's the only way to describe them. They were crazy. And he acknowledged they were crazy. The only problem is, as I say in the book, quoting somebody else, I never said it was possible. I only said it was true. So, you say, yeah, these stories are crazy. Yeah, they sure are crazy. The people weren't crazy. The stories are crazy. But there's no better explanation for what happened than what John said the people themselves put forward, that they, on some level, in some reality, in some dimension, somehow they happened.
Yeah, it was real to them, and real to him through their stories. Do you think that his political convictions played a part in what he was listening to and what he thought? Because at the end of what I read about him, he was pretty pessimistic about the world. He didn't have a very positive outlook.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, he did bring himself into his research in the sense that he thought we had really screwed up the planet, we humans, and he was very happy to hear from the experiencers that they were getting telepathic messages from the alien beings, that they had to take better care of the planet, that humanity is facing a crisis, that Mother Earth is in dire straits. Now, this is what differentiated him from other researchers like Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, who basically saw a very pessimistic, took a very dark view of these experiences and thought that the aliens were first of all very real, operating in our reality, which John Mack was a little less sure of, and also that they were here to steal our DNA and to create a hybrid race. It was all very, very dark to them. And Mack wasn't quite so sure of that. And he also found this transformative aspect where there were messages being given to people, to experiencers, that they had a mission on Earth to fulfill. And they came away from it, by the way, not only traumatized, which they often were, but with a sense of love almost for these alien beings and sympathy for them, and a greater spiritual sense and a sense of almost a religiosity, a belief in God or a great spirit in the universe and intelligence and benign love in the universe. So he took all that, and his critics said, well, he was bringing that. Isn't it strange that he believed that and his experiencers ended up believing that? Was he implanting that? And I'm convinced after looking at his material that he was not making them say that. They found that, and people who worked with other researchers than John Mack also found that to some extent. That they said that the other researchers said that they brought this message too. So that is an interesting part of his research.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
No,
go ahead. Go ahead.
No,
Gracie.
go for it. Go for it.
I just had a quick question about your, obviously the title of the book is called The Believer. To what extent did he believe these stories? And then to what extent do you believe them, Ralph?
Okay, good, tough questions. Well, the title is a little controversial, and I picked it certainly knowing that the term believer is somewhat pejorative in the UFO world. It means somebody who is gullible, who has surrendered his independent thinking, skeptical thinking, but I don't use it in that sense, as I explain in the book. He believed in some very strong values: social justice, in justice on earth, in breaking boundaries, being courageous. He believed in going on a mission when the mission is given to him, like a hero's journey, like Jonah in the Bible. God sends him on a mission. He doesn't want to go, but he goes and has all these adventures. So in that sense, he believed in his mission. He believed in the need to do something different. He always said, I am not a believer, because if a believer means somebody who just swallows, myths whole without checking them out, I am not that. And he wasn't that. He said, I'm only following anecdotal evidence, the kind of evidence that is produced in court that gets people convicted and sentenced to death. And we can talk about this. He did follow a trail of really very convincing evidence in some cases, not necessarily convincing physical evidence, because that is missing in these cases. Yet there were reasons to believe that these people had encountered something very real. So in that sense, I use the word the believer, and I explained at the end of the book that I think he was heroic in taking his beliefs to the point where he risked his reputation. He could have just walked away and said, I'm not doing this. Yeah, this get me in trouble. So for all those reasons, I say it's an apt title of the book. And by the way, I have a subtitle, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack. So I nod to science, which is in the book, because I talk about the scientific evidence and lack of it for these stories, and the fact that he brought this passion to it. Now, what I believe...
I was like, am I going to have to ask again?
And I'm very careful with this. Now, I'm very careful with this. And I actually wrote a piece in the New York Times about this. It was called, Don't Ask If I Believe, or we, Leslie Kane and I, don't ask if we believe in UFOs. Because first of all, as has been said by Margaret Mead, but very famously, and others, UFO means unidentified flying object, as everybody knows. All that means is that there is something unidentified up there. Now, thanks to the Navy videos and a pilot testimony or so, we know that these things exist. We don't know what they are. We don't know where they come from. We don't know what intelligence, if any, is behind them, but we know that there's something there. That's a breakthrough. They are physical. They're not, spiritual constructs or, hallucinations. There's something physical there, although they're unidentified. So if you say, Ralph, do you believe in UFOs? You might as well say, do you believe in the ocean? Do you believe in the stars? Those things are there. It's not a question. It's not a question of having faith in that they exist. They exist. We don't know what they are. So now, do I believe in aliens? I don't know. I've taken it one step at a time. I'm a hard-nosed news reporter. And when I write in the New York Times, I don't write about aliens because the proof is not there. I write about UFOs because the Navy has come forward with videos, which we brought forth in the New York Times. So that I'll say, it's not a question of belief; they exist. The other stuff is much more difficult to process. I believe that the people who told these stories are not making it up, like John Mack said. I believe they are not crazy. I'm convinced, based on experts much greater than myself.
You perfectly led into the question. Oh, sorry, I cut out there. Go ahead.
Experts just, far greater than myself, who have cited this evidence, like John Mack, to say that these are the reasons to credit these stories as something real, maybe not in our dimension, not in our everyday reality, not to be proven, to the extent of, here's an ashtray from a UFO, here's an ashtray from my abduction, here's the wand they knocked me out with. Nice. It'd be nice to have those.
It would be.
But we don't have them. And as a matter of fact, every time somebody says they're going to come forward with something, as John Mack told friends at one point that he had a wand, from an experiencer, from an abductee, and he never produced it. I don't know what happened. He never followed up with that. But that kind of evidence, as far as I know, doesn't exist, hasn't, or at least has not been produced.
May I ask a quick
question? That's a long answer to your question.
No, it's great. It's wonderful. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, real quick, just in relationship to that, because I think it's an important piece that you brought up, because back in, gosh, I believe this was in 2020, or it might have been 2017. You wrote a story called "No Longer in the Shadows: Pentagon's UFO Unit Will Make Some Findings Public." In that, you talk about Eric W. Davis, an astrophysicist who worked as a subcontractor and then a consultant for the Pentagon. And he said that there were materials, and I guess he related this to you, or maybe you can clear this up for me, that we couldn't make ourselves. And it doesn't sound like that any of that has been produced to the public, but did he say that he produced it to the military or to the government?
Well, listen, all I say about that is what we said in the story, was that Eric Davis was among people who briefed congressional committees in a series of briefings that were partly classified and partly unclassified. And we talked about, and we had access to some of the material that was not classified, because we don't, use or solicit classified material. We have never been accused of that, and I don't think we wouldn't do it. Certainly, the Times handles that very differently. Anyway, so unclassified briefings to members of congressional committees dealt with the possibility that materials had been recovered from unidentified flying objects, from crashes or some other way, and these materials were being studied. That was information that was given to members of Congress, okay? That's all we quoted in the Times. In one case, we showed a slide of citing that some of these materials may be off-world. I think that was as far as the slides went. And I'm not willing to go beyond that. The government, the people we spoke to, are very careful not to go beyond that. I know there's people out there who want to know all about materials and what we have, and reverse engineering, and is there a craft somewhere in a hangar? I don't know. It has to be verified before we can report it in the New York Times. The Times is very careful about these things, and justly so, because we stay with what we can back up. And by the way, all our reporting is on the record with names of sources. We don't quote anonymous sources, which is too easy to do, and provokes distrust in readers. So we hold it back until we can put it properly in the paper with full sourcing.
Right.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to John Mack. I think it relates to this topic too, where we're just talking about recent news, with the Pentagon and the confirmation of, various UAP footage and photos, I should say. what do you think John Mack would say? Where would he sit on this? Like, where would he be in the spectrum of it? You know, he is a believer, but what would he think? And would he be an activist? What would be his role today? Because I know he passed away in 2004. So where would we see him today in this type of movement that we have?
That's an interesting question. Well, you know, when he was alive, there was a lot of UFO stuff coming out in the media. He pretty much stuck to his own research. I don't recall him commenting on other cases that he didn't study himself. He was the Betty and Barney Hill abduction case happened in 1961. It became public in 1965. He knew about that, of course, but that was long before he became interested in the subject. And I frankly do not recall anything in all his papers where he's talking about other cases like that. I think he'd be very interested that this stuff is coming out, that the government has changed its tack and is now asking service members to come forward with stories of encounters. That's a big breakthrough from the days when they told people not to come forward. It would hurt, ruin their careers. I think he'd be very happy about that, but I'm not sure he would be in the forefront of the so-called disclosure movement. I think he was much more interested in studying his cases and trying to understand what was going on, behind them.
Yeah. Did he talk to anybody else, like Travis Walton or anybody else that had different experiences outside of his own, patients?
Well, I don't remember seeing anything about his interactions with Travis Walton. He did learn about Bud Hopkins' case with Linda Cortile, Linda Napolitano later by a real name, the so-called Brooklyn Bridge abduction. Which, talking about wild cases, is one of the wildest stories ever. Bud Hopkins wrote a whole book about it called Witnessed. A very, very strange story. All of them are strange, but this one could have been the mother lode of cases, except that Bud Hopkins ran into a brick wall in his inability to identify the two key so-called witnesses. But it's a wonderful story, whether you can accept it at face value. Linda Napolitano is out there. I've talked to her. I've done my own research into some of these cases, so I have not found any other explanation like John Mack that would explain what this phenomenon is all about. And, he always said to the so-called skeptics, he said, look, you got to fulfill these criteria. You've got to, explain how normal people who are not crazy have these memories, how it happens to children as young as 2 years old who don't go to movies and read books. You got to explain why outside where people see a UFO, the ground is sometimes tamped down and foliage is disturbed. You got to explain how sometimes it's witnessed by other people. And if you can explain all that, tell me your theory, I'll buy it. That I think that's a good way to proceed. I agree with that.
Were there any threads of consistencies that really stuck out to Mack throughout the stories of the patients that he spoke with?
Yeah, that was a big factor in convincing him that something real had happened, that the stories he found were basically consistent. I mean, it was these ordinary people, men, women, people of all ages, all professional backgrounds, doctors, psychiatrists, cops, politicians. They were approached or encountered during the night in bed or driving a car or in their everyday lives. It wasn't only at night that they became aware of these beings that they described very often in the same terms, little grays, so-called short, sort of robotic figures with big almond-shaped black eyes, pointy chin, big heads, rubbery kind of limbs, short, about 4 feet, 3.5, 4 feet tall. And then they would be taken through their own walls or windows closed to some kind of a craft. They became aware that they were in some kind of a environment with a bright light, no other visible signs of habitation. They were subject to certain medical procedures, which they described in considerable detail. The instrumentation supervised by taller so-called doctor figures. Sometimes there were eggs might be taken from women, sperm taken from men. Later, they might be re-abducted to see their hybrid offspring. That was a common thread, okay? That was one story. But that was not the only story that people were telling. And there were enough new elements or elements that didn't fit or individual elements in different stories that convinced John Mack that people were not reading off some playbook, like everybody tell this story. We're all going to agree to tell this story. So two things convinced him that something real was going on, that there was a basic consistency to the story, and they were different enough to be individual. So those are two powerful things he found, arguing for the fact that something had happened that we cannot explain in our reality, but something definitely had happened to these people.
Where do we see the academic work now from John Mack? Because he passed away in 2004. He did so much research. Who's taking over it? Is it family? Is it friends? Is it people in in academia circles now? And are academics looking at his work seriously now, or are they still kind of just laughing at him, unfortunately?
Well, that's a good question. There is the John E. Mack Institute, which was set up right at his death, that enshrines quite a bit of his research. That's public. It's JEMI, I think, .org. I'm not, but it's the John E. Mack Institute. It's easy to find online. So that is material that's in the public domain. He wrote two best-selling books. The first one is Abduction, Human Encounters with Aliens, that came out in 1994. That's still available. That's 13 case studies in great detail, a psychiatrist's detail of these 13 people, case studies. They have different names, pseudonyms in the book, but some of them have come forward to say who they were. Randall Nickerson, for example, who's doing a film on the school in Zimbabwe where the children saw a landing. That's a whole episode in itself. Peter Faust, and there's some other people who have willingly come forward and said, I'm in the book, I'm this person. So there's a tremendous amount of research packed into the two books that he wrote, the Abduction and then Passport to the Cosmos. Many of his articles are online. And of course, I have all the resources in my book, and I give the sources of it in the notes where this material exists. Now, his archives have not been opened by his family to the public yet. They have talked about making them available at some institution. Of course, they'd have to be processed and put in a form where researchers could access them. But that may be in the future. So I'm not aware of anybody who's really taken up his burden and now continuing his research. There is research going on. There are certainly experiencer groups that are meeting now as we speak. Support groups where people are sharing their experiences. Some of the experiences have written books of their own. I was just reading one by somebody who talks about experiencing dozens or hundreds of different alien races. The first time I heard that, it's not just the little grays that she encountered, but reptilians and insectoids, and these come up in the experiences accounts, and I don't explain it. John Mack couldn't explain it. He just begun to become aware of that. So there is research being done in terms certainly of experiencer accounts. I don't think anybody at Harvard or Yale has taken this on for obvious reasons, because they saw what happened to John Mack. But I think there will be people.
Like the other thing I was looking at is just the whole experiencer subculture that they have. It really is growing, and I've watched it just from afar and looking at, there's apps now that you can become an experiencer and join a group. Would John Mack be someone that would probably endorse this in this type of community, because it's growing and it's starting to not trickle into the mainstream yet, but it will at some point. Would he endorse that, or would he find, because people are capitalizing off an experiencer when a lot of these experiences are traumatic for people and cause other issues of mental health and things like that. So this capitalization of a subculture, like where would he see himself in that? If you could.
That's an interesting question. I mean, in some ways it runs counter to his experience, which was that the people who he interviewed, I wouldn't even say came forward, because they didn't come forward in the sense that they went public. He got them to talk to him. They were always shy. They were embarrassed by what had happened, deeply puzzled. In some cases, he wrote, they would have preferred to be called crazy. They said, John, Dr. Mack, I was hoping you'd tell me I'm crazy, because the alternative, that these things really happened, are too terrifying to contemplate. I'd be happy if you told me I had just imagined it, or I'm out of my mind. So it is a bit strange that these groups are coming forward publicly, although I would wonder how public they really are. They're certainly coming forward for each other. They're support groups. And yes, people are coming forward to write books about their experience. That he would probably be a bit surprised, because, as I said, his experience was that these people were reluctant to come forward because it hurts them at work. They endure ridicule. It questions their sanity. It is interesting. I mean, we live in a culture where everything is now out in the open. People are, writing on the internet. There's no secrets anymore. Everything gets snapped up for the movies. So perhaps people they overcome their reluctance, think, well, maybe we can make a buck out of this, or, if someone else is making money with a book or a movie, maybe I can too. So perhaps that is trickling out. But most of the people I've encountered, and I've just interviewed some experiences very recently, they are still very concerned about going public. They're very nervous about it. It's not what the skeptics and the debunkers say. Oh, these people are publicity seekers. They're out to tell their story. They're not. They're desperately afraid to be known as for what they endured. They don't know what happened to them.
So many questions.
do you think so? Based on that, do you think that the coverage that we're seeing now in the mainstream media, we've got obviously you at the New York Times have broken several stories, and since then we've seen people like John Radcliffe come out. We've seen Gadi Schwartz break stories recently on NBC. There's even talk of a Lou Elizondo interview on 60 Minutes. Do you think these things will make a difference and start to bring this topic out of the fringe, so that the very people you're talking about feel more comfortable speaking about this matter publicly?
Well, the media has picked it up. There's no doubt about it. And people have said, let's put it that way, that the Times was the one that, sort of broke the ice on this topic in 2017 with our story of the secret Pentagon unit, ATIP, that Lou Elizondo headed then. So I think, yes, the fact that it was in the New York Times in a respectful way made it safe for other media, mainstream media, to weigh in. I think, again, you got to differentiate between the UFO stories and abduction stories. That has not gone mainstream, as far as I know. There's too many questions about it.
Right.
It's been in movies, obviously, and TV and series and all that. But definitely, mainstream media has picked up the UFO accounts and the videos that have come forth.
Yeah, you actually went right into the next question that I have about seeing that the UFO and the abduction conversations, are they connected? And if you're saying they're not connected, or they are, like, how would you describe both phenomenons? Because there are times that the stories are connected. You see an abduction and then a UFO is present. Where do you see that sit?
Yeah, well, it's very important to stick to what we can verify. And the UFO phenomenon, you don't even have to call it a phenomenon anymore. UFOs, period. They exist. We've seen their pictures. We've seen their videos. They've been caught on radar tracks. They've been caught on FLIR devices, thermal imaging devices. That is that's easy to report on. And now, the different accounts of Navy ships encountering these swarms of UFOs or whatever they are, that is being picked up widely. But I think you still have to differentiate between that and experiencer accounts, because it's much harder to verify those. It's impossible, basically, because they're so subjective. They haven't come with photographic or video, documentation. Whenever anyone has tried to set up, tripwire cameras or so to capture, nightly visitations or whatever, the pictures don't come out. Does the alien technology defeat these devices? Is there something else going on? The implants, so-called, the people who, say that they've received these implants and then they've later recovered them during surgical operations. I'm not aware of them withstanding, outside scrutiny. There's a lot of accounts of them. So that's a very different area, and I think you have to keep that separate. We may reach a point where there'll be documentation of these episodes, or maybe some research, and this is what I'm hoping, will show that some functions in the mind and the psyche of the brain, to put it in a physical term, will reveal some ability to connect with another intelligence or other intelligences in the universe. So there'll be some scientific basis to understand what it is that enables people to interact or encounter these other intelligences. That would be a kind of a breakthrough. But until then, I think we have to keep separate the UFOs, the physical objects, without speculating, where are the aliens, behind the wheel.
I agree. I don't think our science is there yet. And at some point it will be able to describe and giving credit back to science to describe what's actually happening, to some of these people. And for them, to them, it's real. And being able to make that into actually having a conversation, in an academic conversation. When we look at John Mack too, we see, from what I know, and maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong, Ralph, a lot of his patients were from North America. Did culture play a perspective in it? Like, was everybody Caucasian? Were people, from different ethnicities? Because interesting of their perception of how they've experienced something happen to them, along with then if he's interviewing and talking to, or not interviewing, if he's talking to people that are just Caucasian or just from North America, I'm curious to see what that perspective would be while looking at other places around the world that are dealing with this.
No, his research, he focused mostly on people around him in the Boston area, but he traveled all over the world searching for experiencer accounts. And he found them in Zimbabwe, this school of children outside the capital of Harare in Rua, the Ariel School, where in 1995 there was the children reported a landing of a craft and interaction with two small beings who communicated telepathically with the children. They later drew pictures of that. John Mack flew to Zimbabwe to document it on camera and tape, and I had access to those interviews. Those were mixed race children, white, black, different races. He interacted in South Africa with indigenous people who spoke about the long history in their cultures of interaction with small beings. He was in Brazil, spent a lot of time in Brazil checking out stories of strange encounters. For some reason, Brazil seems to have the strangest encounters, the strangest beings. And he documented that. So your perception is not correct. He did not limit his research to Caucasians. He went around the world noting that this phenomenon is international. And there are cultural differences in terms of, how many people report and who has the ability to report and where are the reporting organizations located. So there's a skewing of the data really based on, not everybody has a MUFON. The
Right.
Mutual UFO Network. But that doesn't mean that it's a North American phenomenon.
I'm curious. Oh,
Sorry.
Go ahead, Chrissy.
No, go, Mike. Go. Take it, my friend. I have so many now. Go for it.
I know. So that's what happens when you have an amazing guest. So
It's true.
We just got to recognize that.
Very much.
I'm really curious about this Zimbabwe case, and I've seen a little bit of the footage. But you had an opportunity to go back and watch these tapes, and read the memoirs. Can you tell us a little bit more about that case? What, from your perspective, just looking through the window, what happened there?
Yeah, this was probably the most important landing case, sighting, and close encounter case that exists, because the witnesses were so good. They were children who, as I say, can't be accused of, you took this from books you read, or you watched, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So these were children, and they spoke in very basic terms of what they had seen, very unsophisticated and very clear as to what they had seen. So what happened is they were in the schoolyard. They were at recess. And they became aware of a bunch of colored lights in the sky, and then something landed, and these two creatures got out, very small, in some kind of black uniform. They were described very interestingly as one had long hair like Michael Jackson. And they stared at the students. The students stared back, and some of the students recalled getting telepathic messages like they had to be better stewards of the earth, and the earth is in serious trouble. And some of them felt love for these creatures. They were scared, but they felt some kind of a bond. Anyway, they described all this afterwards. They went running to the teachers. And very interestingly, no teachers witnessed this. The landing, whatever it was, occurred during recess when the kids were in the yard, and the teachers were preoccupied, and they were not there. So the kids came running in to tell them the stories. And afterwards, they asked John Mack, well, what do you think about, why there were no adults present? And he said, I'm really not good on alien psychology. I don't know what was going through their mind. Did they work it out that way? I mean, it was just so strange. And it was so symbolic of how this phenomenon shows itself at certain times, in certain ways, not to everybody at the same time. I mean, it's not landing on the White House lawn, as people keep saying. Why don't they do that? And then ask to see the president. Then everybody would believe it. That's not how this, phenomenon has unfolded. But whatever, these children, 60 of them approximately, witnessed this. They drew pictures afterwards. They were interviewed at great length by John Mack, who asked them very basic questions, not leading questions. What did you see, and what did you think? And the answers are very revealing and charmingly, childlike. I thought they were lost. I thought they wanted us to love them. Just strange things. And so that became, I think, a paradigm case. And now they've been, filmmakers have gone back, re-interviewed these adults now who were children then, and they remember these events clearly all these years later. So it's a phenomenal, work of history now to go back and compare their original accounts with what they remember today. So, but that is it's a striking case that skeptics, so-called, need to study before they, issue blanket, condemnation. Oh, these people are crazy. Oh, this is ridiculous. Of course it's ridiculous, but, that doesn't explain it.
It's fair. It's so fair. Would you call John Mack obsessed with this topic? Would you, because what about his other work? Like, what happened to his other psychology work? He just seems like he was so embedded into this topic.
Well, I guess he was obsessed. I mean, it's not a bad thing. He was driven by it. A reporter from Psychology Today asked him, why are you so gripped by this topic? And he said, well, who wouldn't be? I mean, my God, this is extraordinary. These people, recounting things that can't possibly be true. And yet there's no other explanation for what happened. So yes, he was obsessed in that sense. He was driven to continue despite the obstacles, including the risk of his career at Harvard. But afterwards, he changed somewhat. He moved away from the physical explanation to encompass some kind of a dimensional situation, that these things were happening in some kind of other dimension that was penetrating, is the word he used, our dimension, but not visible always to us in our daily lives. And then he became aware of other spiritual phenomena, like crop circles, which he investigated in England, and ultimately survival of consciousness. What happens after we die, and why do people get images of dead relatives and friends after they die? What accounts for this, for ghosts and all these things? And he himself, as I say at the end of the book, appeared to friends and colleagues after he died, or at least they had the sense that his presence was there. And I explain, look, I'm not giving this the same credibility I give scientifically verifiable details elsewhere in the book, such as UFO sightings, etc. But these are also anecdotal accounts, and sometimes very compelling accounts of people who sensed his presence after he died, and he had messages, and he was himself obsessed to an extent with this whole story of where he would go when he died, and he was in a way ready when he was killed. Like Lawrence, his great idol, he was also looking ahead, perhaps, to the next chapter in his non-life.
Wow, Mike I think it paused there. Mike?
Uh-oh.
Oh.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Just wait for
You hear me?
Now we can hear you now, Ralph.
Okay. So he moved on to other aspects of the paranormal, and one line I want to get in, because he always said that he was looking for signs of intelligent life on Earth, and he wanted people to believe what he believed, that there was something worth looking into here. That's all. Don't resist it out of hand. Don't negate it. Don't debunk it without doing the research. I mean, he went to a whole conference at MIT in 1992 with atomic physicists, theologians, social workers, scientists of all kinds, folklorists, and they all try to grapple with this phenomenon that they knew from their experience or accounts, had happened to these people somehow. And they all try to figure out, what it was. And of course they never got the answer, but they put out a book, this thick, with their research. And anyone who wants to look into this before they debunk it and say it's ridiculous, which it is, you've got to read a book like that.
Yeah. You brought up the word folklore, like you're going right into the questions I want to ask you. The folklore part, was he really attached to that? Did he find himself, liking folklore and then attaching it to his work as well? Or did he keep the two separate?
Well, he became aware, and this is more in his second book, actually. The first book, Abduction, was criticized because it took too credulous an account of the stories he was hearing. And that was the big criticism that people made, that he was adopting their stories. Now, it wasn't really true. If you read the book, you'll see that he was subjecting these stories to skeptical inquiry, and he spent a great deal of time analyzing, the stories people were telling him. But in the end, people had the sense that he was accepting it as real. So in the second book, he tried to answer their criticism by putting these encounters in a more of a sociological, anthropological context, by saying, which is true, that throughout history, there have been sightings of strange beings and objects in the sky, and encounters, not only the Bible, but all kinds of, literature from ancient India, from every culture you can imagine, talks about encounters with non-human beings. This has traditionally been written off as folklore. I mean, it's just a story, or religious. I mean, the sightings at Fatima, and all the sightings of the Bible, the chariots in the sky, and God's turned up on earth, or it could be some account of early encounters between humans and non-humans going back to the dawn of time. So he became aware of that, Jacques Vallée's books and others talking about the folkloric traditions. And when John went to South Africa and he met Credo Mutwa, one of the indigenous leaders, and Mutwa told him about the little people that we've always interacted with, and they had little statues of little men, which he took to be alien beings. So John did accept that later in his life, that this had a long history.
Oh. Well, I think we're getting close to end of time. Ralph, thank you. And is there anything else that you're working on that you want to share with us, or anything that's coming out in the next little bit?
Well, I'm doing more, research on this. I'm still working with some experiencers. I'm trying to learn more about the phenomenon. I'm still captivated, like John was, in this subject. I'm not ready to move on to. It's kind of hard to move on to something else after this, because there's no answer. You see, that's the thing. No one has solved this mystery. It's out there. This and what happens after death are the two biggies. Is there life in the universe, other life? And what kind of life or intelligence is there? And what is there after death, and are they connected? Is there some other dimension where other beings and after death experiences sort of combined? So that'll keep me busy for a while.
That's great. Thank you, Ralph.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ralph. If you haven't gotten your copy yet, make sure you go grab The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and The Passion of John Mack. Ralph Blumenthal, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you, guys. Pleasure for me too. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.